My name is Alexander Rose. I'm the Executive Director of the Long Now Foundation. I usually start with a story about the beams at New College, Oxford, that they planted a grove of oaks 500 years before they needed to be replaced. And I thought with the previous talk on materials that this was an even more appropriate one, so I swapped some slides out. The project that I'm working on is a 10,000-year project, and I've collected stories where people have looked far ahead in both art and design. Just recently, I was at the Vatican, and I was getting a tour of the library from the vice prefect, and we went by this room at the Vatican, and it was a room full of the thinnest drawers I'd ever seen. And he invited me in, and we opened up the drawers, and it looked like this. They looked like little pixels. But it turned out that when they commissioned all of the mosaics at the Vatican, they also required the artists to do overruns of every color of tile. And to this day, 500 years later, they're still maintaining those mosaics with those tiles. And it's this type of thinking that some of the founders of the Long Now Foundation realized was not going on anymore. And I would suspect that most of you artists in the room have rarely been asked to make sure that your art is maintainable for the next 500 years. Danny Hillis, a computer scientist who is largely responsible for a lot of the accelerating culture, was realizing that with stories like this one, that we need new types of monuments to long-term thinking. He was very interested in building a monument-scale, 10,000-year clock. And Stuart Brand, who you heard about a little bit earlier, who was the founder of the Whole Earth Catalog, heard this idea and said, well, that's great, but maybe we should also have a library or an information storage service that lasts alongside of that. For the last 12 years, I've worked with both of them, as well as a group of other artists and technologists like Brian Eno and Paul Sappho, who teaches a futures class here, on building objects and information services that can last on this time scale. This time scale was chosen fairly carefully. One of the first things that we worked out was this diagram. There's Stuart Brand and Brian Eno and I were trying to pick apart the layers of human time. And the idea that fashion and art and design is actually the fastest moving layer, and it's the most chaotic moving layer, moving down through commerce, infrastructure, governance, culture, and nature being at the very bottom, trying to figure out where problems occur, such as if you're Pacific Lumber and you're up there on the commerce scale and you're selling old growth redwoods on a natural scale that only reproduce themselves on millennial scales, then clearly you've skipped a bunch of those layers and something is wrong with what you're doing. So there's other time scales that we could have chosen besides 10,000 years. One of them would be the astronomic time scales that are in the billions of years, or the millions of years of geologic time scales. But this 10,000-year time scale is an interesting one, especially now as we're looking at climate change. The last 10,000 years is the amount of time that the Earth has had the most stable climate in all the ice coring and all of the other core sampling that we've done. So clearly this moment of stable climate is the reason that we have the civilization that we have now. And so that was chosen as the time frame going forward. Some precedents and lessons of objects in the past that are informing our decisions are things like this Antikythera device. This was a clock. This was an astronomical clock. It still to this day defies everyone's understanding of mechanics in 2,000 years ago. None of these types of mechanics were seen for another 1,500 years. Yet this device was pulled out, and now we've actually reconstructed it. Some folks at the Science Museum in London, through X-ray technology, have been able to reconstruct it, and in fact it was an orrery type of clock. It was an astronomic type of clock. Other instances through history where people have done very long-term projects. Obviously, one that comes to mind is the pyramids, about 5,000 years old. This is an interesting one to me because the outer skin was pretty much pillaged within a few centuries after it was finished to build mosques in Cairo. So, but we still have the pyramids, they're still iconic, so they still are a success on some level. The Taj Mahal, I think, is another very interesting one. It basically survived because all of the inside walls of the Taj Mahal were encrusted with jewels. So when it was pillaged, and for the last time pillaged by England, pretty much for the crown jewels, they spent a lot of time prying those jewels out of the walls. And if they hadn't had those jewels in the walls, they probably would have burned it like they did many of the other buildings, or destroyed it like many of the other buildings, and it wouldn't have survived. So putting expensive trinkets on the front, in the case of the pyramids, that was the outside casing stones. In the case of Taj Mahal, it was the inside gems. The other method of building things that can last for a very long time is to just take a really long time doing it. This is the cathedral at Cologne. This was started in 1248 and finished in 1880. So it was a 600-year project. And this is a critical type of project for me, because if you look at the Victorians in San Francisco, there was a time when they were out of fashion. It's basically the one generation, 50 to 100 years after something is in fashion, it goes out of fashion, and people start tearing it down, and they put up those really awful-looking square apartment buildings. And now we consider those same Victorians treasures. And just like this may have had a moment where this type of architecture was considered old-fashioned, they weren't quite done with it, so they never really tore it down. And we're seeing the same thing happening with Gaudi's Cathedral through its many fits and starts, and now seems to be well on its way towards another phase of construction in Barcelona. This is the other 10,000-year project. We actually went on a tour of this recently. It's the Yucca Mountain Waste Repository. This is where we are going to be potentially storing the nuclear waste from all the plants in the country. It's a pretty impressive engineering project. Unfortunately, it's an engineering project likely trying to solve a political problem, and the number of people that are going to lay down on the track stopping the nuclear waste getting there may make it so it never is a success. This other one is just now completed. This is actually a rendering, and they did it very fast. This is the Seed Vault in Svalbard, which is being designed to, in an interesting, another kind of shared space, like Antarctica and potentially like the Smog project, in that this Svalbard is what's called a condominium island, in that it's owned by many, many countries. And so therefore, since nobody has ownership, it's a very stable place to put things. Now they did make an assumption, of course, that it should go here because this would be a good place when global warming happens, but if the Greenland pump stops working, this could end up under many miles of ice, so our seeds may not be safe there. We'll see. And this is one of my favorite examples. This is the shrine at Ise in Japan. It's a Shinto shrine, and it's built out of very ephemeral materials, wood and rice paper and things like that, but it's been rebuilt every 20 years in an exact replica of itself in an adjacent site for now at least 500 years, some records say over 1,000 years. So this is a way where the institution reminds the object and vice versa.